New Orleans, 1788. March. The air is thick, humid, heavy with the smell of river mud and smoldering wood. A city is on fire, not metaphorically, not partially, on fire. Nearly 900 buildings gone. In a single afternoon, one of the most important port cities in the Western Hemisphere is reduced to ash and smoke and the sound of people crying in the street. And here is the astonishing thing. It happened again. 6 years later, in 1794, a second fire tore through what had just been rebuilt, and once again, the city burned. And yet, New Orleans survived. It did not just survive, it transformed. It became something stranger, richer and more complicated than it had ever been before. This is the story of New Orleans between 1773 and 1800, 2007 years. When this city was controlled by Spain, we built twice from the ground up and turned into the most culturally layered, strategically vital and genuinely chaotic city in the Americas. We will stop at 12 locations. And by the end, I think you will understand something that goes far beyond colonial history, how the cities that survive the worst disasters are never quite the same cities that went in. I will take you through this story using what I call the survival equation: disaster, then rebuild, then identity, then power shift. Every single location we visit today fits somewhere in that sequence, and when you see it whole, the picture is remarkable. Here is where we are going. We start with the river, the Mississippi, because without it, none of this exists. Not the city, not the trade, not the empire. Then we move into the streets and squares where Spanish governors tried, often unsuccessfully, to impose order on a city that had no interest in being governed. Then the fires come, 2 of them, and we watch what burns and what gets built in its place. In the middle of all of this, while governors argue and buildings collapse, there is a square on the edge of the city where something else entirely is happening. Something that will outlast every governor, every empire, every flag that flies over this place. And finally, we arrive at the end of the century, 1800, when Spain quietly hands Louisiana back to France, and America starts watching from across the river, hungry. We will stop at 12 locations across this city. By the end, you will not just know the history, you will feel why this place was worth fighting over. The Mississippi River. Before you understand anything about New Orleans, you have to understand the river. The Mississippi River is not a backdrop to this story. It is the reason the story exists at all. In the late 18th century, the river carries the economic lifeblood of an entire continent. Everything produced in the interior of North America, furs, cotton, tobacco, grain, timber, eventually floats down to New Orleans. The city sits at the mouth of this vast drainage system like a toll booth. Whoever controls New Orleans controls the trade of half a continent. Stand on the levee in 1773 and the smell hits you first: raw river water, fish, rotting wood, the sharp tang of tar from the boats. The sound is constant, the creak of rope against hull, shouted commands in French, Spanish, and languages you cannot place. The boats keep coming. Spain understood this perfectly. That is why, even though they never particularly loved New Orleans, even though they found it expensive, ungovernable, and far too French, they refused to let it go. Because the river was leverage. The river was empire. This is the first truth of the survival equation. The reason a city gets rebuilt after disaster is that it is worth rebuilding. And New Orleans was worth it because of this river. From this place you understand that geography is not just scenery, geography is destiny. Cities built on strategic rivers do not die in fires. They get rebuilt. Today the Mississippi is still there, still moving, still feeding the port. And New Orleans is still, technically, one of the busiest ports in the United States. The river won every argument, but the river was also a threat. And managing that threat required something the Spanish struggled with constantly, just a few meters from the waterline: the New Orleans levee system. The land New Orleans sits on should not have a city on it. This is not an opinion. This is geology. The city rests on a thin layer of sediment deposited by the river, barely above sea level, surrounded by swamp on 3 sides and open water on a 4th. The only reason it stays dry, sometimes barely, is the levee system. In the Spanish colonial period, the levees were not the massive engineered structures you might imagine. They were earthen embankments built largely by enslaved people, maintained imperfectly and constantly at risk of failure. When the river rose in spring, which it did every year, the threat of inundation was real and constant. Spanish administrators spent enormous energy writing letters about the levees. There are colonial records full of urgent requests for more labor, more materials, more funds. The answers from Havana and Madrid were slow. The river, meanwhile, did not wait for replies. This tells you something important. The Spanish Empire in New Orleans was always managing a city it could not fully afford to maintain. The infrastructure was always slightly behind the threat. The levees held, mostly but barely. From this place you understand that empire is not just about armies and flags. It is about drainage and earthworks and the willingness to pay for them. Spain was not always willing. Today, New Orleans has a vastly more sophisticated flood management system, and as the world learned in 2005, even that was not enough. The same vulnerability that existed in 1790 existed in 2005. The river and the sea have long memories. That impermanence, that sense that the city was always one bad season away from disappearing, shaped everything about how people lived here, including the people in the grandest buildings on the grandest street. Oil Street, Royal Street, in the years of Spanish control, was where money lived. The merchants, the senior officials, the landowners, their homes lined this street, their shuttered windows looking out onto a road that was, in heavy rain, essentially a river of mud. The smell of horse, of cooking fires, of sugar, which by the 1790s was becoming a dominant crop, hung in the warm air constantly. These were not modest people. They had come from France, from Spain, from Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti, and they had built, or were building, fortunes based on trade and enslaved labor. They dressed formally, even in the heat. They threw parties. They argued politics in the careful way of people who knew that the wrong opinion, said to the wrong person, had consequences. The class divide on Royal Street was visible in every detail. The grand houses on one side, the servants and enslaved workers who maintained those houses, largely invisible in the historical record, but absolutely present in the actual street. From this place you understand that colonial wealth was never built alone. It was built on a structure of exploitation so embedded that contemporaries often did not even see it as a choice. It was simply the way things were. This matters today because Royal Street is still there. Still one of the most elegant streets in the French Quarter, still lined with antique shops and galleries. Beautiful and loaded with history that not all of its visitors pause to consider. The elegance of Royal Street existed in direct relationship to the suffering elsewhere in the city, and the most direct evidence of that elsewhere was a square, not far away, where a very different kind of life was being lived, Congo Square. On Sunday afternoons, in an open field on the edge of the city, just beyond the formal grid of streets, past the edge of what the Spanish considered proper New Orleans, something remarkable happened. Enslaved people gathered. Spanish law, specifically the Code Noir as adapted under Spanish rule, permitted enslaved people 1 day of rest per week. Sunday. And in New Orleans, that Sunday gathering had a location, the place that would eventually be called Congo Square, though in this period it had no formal name. It was simply where people went. The sound you would have heard standing at the edge of that field on a Sunday in 1790 was unlike anything in Europe. Drums, specific rhythms carried across the Atlantic from West Africa and Central Africa, call and response singing, dancing with a physicality and complexity that French and Spanish observers found extraordinary and often threatening. This was not entertainment. This was cultural preservation under conditions of extreme oppression. These were people who had lost their names, their families, their freedom, and their homes. And they were, on Sunday afternoons, keeping alive the musical and spiritual traditions that no one could physically take from them. Here is the under-discussed truth that matters most in this whole story, the culture that makes New Orleans globally famous. The jazz, the brass bands, the second lines, the food, the Mardi Gras Indians, all of it traces its DNA back here, not to the cathedral, not to the governor, to Congo Square on a Sunday afternoon in the Spanish colonial period. From this place you understand that cultural power and political power are not the same thing. The people with no political power created the culture that outlasted every empire. Today, Congo Square is part of Armstrong Park, named for Louis Armstrong, the man who carried this city's music to the world. The square is still there. The drums still occasionally play there. Some continuities refuse to be broken. Just a short distance away, on the same side of the city, stood the physical symbol of the power that tried to control all of this. Spain arrived in New Orleans in 1769 with soldiers, because that is how empires arrive when they are not entirely sure they are welcome. They were correct to be unsure. The French Creole population of New Orleans had not been consulted about being transferred to Spain. They had in fact sent a delegation to Paris to protest. Paris had not listened. Governor Alejandro O'Reilly, an Irishman in Spanish service, which alone tells you something about how strange this empire was, arrived with over 2,000 troops. He established order by executing the leaders of a local rebellion. Quickly, publicly, message delivered. The Spanish barracks, built to house these soldiers, sat on the edge of the French quarter. The clank of armor and weapons, the drill commands in Spanish, the smell of horses and gunpowder. This was Spain saying, "We are here, we are armed, and we are staying." But here is what the barracks also revealed. Spain maintained this military presence not because New Orleans was dangerous to outsiders, but because it was difficult to govern from inside. The city was too French, too Caribbean, too independent-minded. The soldiers were not there to protect the city. They were there to remind it who was in charge. From this place you understand that military presence is often a sign of political weakness, not strength. If everyone simply agreed to be governed, you would not need a barracks on every corner. Today, no original Spanish barrack structure survives in its original form. But the memory of this military architecture lives in the bones of the neighborhood, in the way blocks were laid out, in property lines that date to Spanish land grants, in names on maps that are older than the United States. The soldiers took their orders from one specific building, the administrative heart of Spanish New Orleans, a building that still stands today. The Cabildo, the word comes from the Spanish for town council, was the seat of government in Spanish New Orleans. The building you can visit today was completed in 1799, right at the very end of our story, but the institution it housed was the engine of colonial administration throughout this entire period. In the halls of the Cabildo, Spanish governors signed documents, heard legal cases, and attempted to regulate a city that constantly resisted regulation. The records from this period are remarkably detailed. Lists of property, records of disputes, minutes of council meetings, all of it written in Spanish. In a city where most people still thought in French. Sitting in those rooms, a governor would have heard the scratch of quill on paper, the occasional raised voice from a petitioner outside, and, drifting in through the open windows, the perpetual noise of the market just steps away. The voices, the haggling, the sound of a city that did not particularly care what the paperwork said. The Cabildo also administered the legal system, and under Spanish law, that system was significantly different from what the French had used. Property rights changed, inheritance laws changed. Most consequentially, Spanish law gave enslaved people certain limited legal rights that French law had not, including in some cases the right to purchase their own freedom. The result was a significant free black population in New Orleans by the 1790s, a demographic complexity unlike almost anywhere else in North America. From this place you understand that governance is never just about power. It is about which rules you impose, and those rules shape who gets to be what in a society for generations. Today the Cabildo is a museum, the Louisiana State Museum to be precise. And in a remarkable historical symmetry, it is the building where the Louisiana Purchase Transfer documents were signed in 1803. The Spanish colonial administration building became the room where the American era began. Right next to the Cabildo, sharing the same square, stands the building that represented the other half of colonial authority. The church, St. Louis Cathedral and Chair Street. The church and the government sat side by side, facing the same square for a reason. In the colonial world, religious authority and political authority were not separate. They were partners. The cathedral validated the governor protected the cathedral. And the square in front of both of them, what would become Jackson Square, was where that partnership was displayed to the public. The first St. Louis Cathedral burned in the Great Fire of 1788. It was not particularly mourned as a structure. It had always been a modest, somewhat inadequate building. What was mourned was the symbolic vacuum its destruction created. A city without a cathedral in the 18th century felt incomplete in a way that went beyond architecture. The rebuilding was funded largely by a local merchant, Don Andrés Almonesta y Roxas, a Spanish-born businessman who had made his fortune in New Orleans and understood, with perfect clarity, that financing the cathedral was also the best advertisement money could buy. His name was placed on the building. His legacy was secured. The rebuilt cathedral was consecrated in 1794, the same year as the Second Great Fire. It survived that fire, partly by luck, partly by virtue of being made of more substantial materials than its neighbors. The street that runs past the cathedral, Chart Street, was, in this period, the spine of governmental and religious New Orleans. Walk it in 1795, and within a few hundred meters, you pass the Cabildo, the cathedral, the Presbytère, and the homes of the most powerful men in the colony. From this place you understand that colonial power concentrated itself spatially. It put its symbols next to each other so that their authority could reinforce each other. Today, St. Louis Cathedral is the oldest continuously active cathedral in the United States. It still faces Jackson Square. It still, in a sense, partners with the government buildings on either side. The arrangement has barely changed in 200 years. And the square in front of it, what in 1788 was the Place d'Armes, was the stage on which colonial power performed itself, for better and for worse. Jackson Square. Before it was Jackson Square, before the statue of Andrew Jackson on his rearing horse, before the tarot card readers and the street musicians, this was the Place d'Armes. Every colonial city had one, the central square where the military drilled, where official proclamations were read aloud, where public punishments happened. In New Orleans, the Place d'Armes served all of these functions and more. Stand here in 1780. The square is not the manicured garden you see today. It is an open, unpaved ground, dusty in summer, muddy in winter, always smelling of the river and the market nearby. Soldiers drill in formation. A notice is being read aloud by an official in Spanish to a crowd that mostly understands French. A public punishment is administered at the edge of the square, the colonial government making its authority visible and physical. This is where the population was reminded regularly that they lived under a particular power, not through paperwork, through presence. The fires changed what surrounded this square entirely. Before 1788, the buildings facing the Place d'Armes were primarily wooden French colonial structures. After the fires and the rebuilding, they were Spanish-style brick and stucco. The square stayed, the architecture around it transformed. From this place you understand that public squares are political instruments. They are designed to make authority feel natural and permanent. And yet the buildings surrounding this one burned twice and were rebuilt in a different style. Nothing about colonial authority was as permanent as it tried to appear. Today, Jackson Square is one of the most visited public spaces in America. The cathedral still dominates one side. The Cabildo and Presbytère flank it. And in the center, Jackson rides his horse, a general who had nothing to do with the Spanish colonial era, installed in 1856 as a different kind of political statement. Layer upon layer upon layer. And now, the Thirst Fire, the one that changed everything. Location number 9, The Great Fire of Good Friday, 1788, March 21st. A candle, a chapel, a wind from the south. The fire started, sources suggest, in the private chapel of the military treasurer on what is now Chartres Street. The candle ignited the drapes ignited the walls ignited the building, and the wind, as winds do, spread the fire to the next building and the next and the next. New Orleans in 1788 was mostly wooden. French colonial building tradition used timber. The streets were narrow. There was no organized fire brigade capable of stopping what was now happening. The fire moved faster than people could run. By the time it burned out, 856 buildings were destroyed, nearly the entire city. The cathedral, the Cabildo, houses, warehouses, storerooms, the accumulated material life of several thousand people, gone. The death toll was, by the standards of such disasters, relatively low. Most people escaped. But the economic and psychological devastation was total. Survivors picked through ash and charred timber looking for anything salvageable. The smell of smoke hung over the city for weeks. Here is the thing that is rarely said clearly. The Great Fire of 1788 was the best thing that could have happened to the physical city of New Orleans. Not for the people who lost everything. For them it was catastrophic. But for the city as a built environment, the fire created an opportunity to rebuild in brick in a Spanish style, with wider streets and better materials. The New Orleans you can walk through today, the French Quarter, that is architecturally almost entirely Spanish, was made possible by this fire. From this place you understand that the survival equation demands destruction before transformation. The rebuilt city was stronger, more beautiful and more distinctly itself than the one that burned. This matters today because New Orleans has survived catastrophe repeatedly. 1788, 1794, the hurricanes of the 20th and 21st centuries. Each time, the question is not whether it will rebuild, but what it will become in the rebuilding. But barely had the city found its feet when, 6 years later, disaster returned. The Great Fire, December 8, 1794, a religious holiday, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The second fire started in the same general area of the city as the first. This time, 212 buildings burned, fewer than in 1788, partly because the rebuilding after the first fire had used more brick. But the psychological impact was devastating. The city had spent 6 years rebuilding, and now fire again. The sound of it at night, the crackle, the roar, the screaming of people, the panic of animals, must have felt, to survivors of the first fire, like a nightmare repeating. Some must have wondered whether the city could survive twice, whether it was worth staying. It was, and they did. The second rebuilding was faster and more confident than the first. Spanish colonial architecture now dominated completely. The narrow wooden French-style structures were replaced definitively. What emerged in the years between 1795 and 1800 was, physically, the city we now call the French Quarter, built almost entirely by Spanish architects under Spanish rule, with Spanish materials and Spanish aesthetics. The great irony of New Orleans is contained entirely in this fact. The neighborhood called the French Quarter is architecturally Spanish, because the French buildings burned twice. From this place you understand that naming and reality are often disconnected. The French Quarter is a Spanish city wearing a French name, a monument to the way catastrophe and colonial politics can reshape identity while the signage stays the same. Today, tourists walk through the French Quarter admiring the ironwork balconies, the stucco walls, the inner courtyards, all of it Spanish, none of it French, and almost none of the visitors aware of the distinction. The fires that destroyed a city also became invisible, absorbed into an aesthetic that now seems eternal. In the shadow of this rebuilt city, in the building that sat next to the cathedral, the administrative machinery of this transformation was kept. The Presbytère was intended to be the residence and administrative center for the clergy of the cathedral, symmetrical to the Cabildo on the other side. A deliberate architectural statement about the partnership of church and state. It was never finished during the Spanish period. Construction began in 1791, stalled, resumed, stalled again. Money was tight. Priorities shifted. The colony was, as always, slightly underfunded relative to its needs. The unfinished Presbytère is a perfect symbol of Spanish rule in New Orleans, ambitious in concept, impressive in partial execution, perpetually incomplete. Spain had grand plans for this city. It never quite had the resources or the political will to see them all through. Inside what was completed, the rustling of administrative papers, the footsteps of clergy on stone floors, the muffled sound of the city outside, this was the texture of colonial religious administration, orderly on the surface, improvised underneath. From this place you understand that imperial ambition is often larger than imperial capacity. Spain wanted New Orleans to reflect the dignity of its empire. What it got was a half-built administrative building and a city that remains stubbornly, beautifully, chaotically itself. Today, the Presbytère, finally completed long after the Spanish left, houses the Louisiana State Museum. Its Mardi Gras exhibit in particular draws visitors from across the world. A building meant to house clerical order now celebrates the city's most deliberately disorderly annual tradition. New Orleans has a way of doing this. Just steps away, a final location. One that represents not the power of the colonial administration, but the power that was about to inherit everything. Stand at the edge of the French Quarter in 1799. The city smells of river mud, of baking bread from the market, of horses and smoke. The streets are busier than they have ever been. New Orleans in 1800 has a population of perhaps 8,000 people. French Creoles, Spanish administrators, free people of color, enslaved people, American traders who arrive from upriver with goods and ambitions and loud opinions. The city is, by any measure, more diverse and more cosmopolitan than almost anywhere in North America, and it is about to change hands. Again, in 1800, Spain signs the Treaty of San Ildefonso and secretly transfers Louisiana back to France. Napoleon has plans. He imagines a French empire in the Americas centered on Saint-Domingue, Haiti, with New Orleans as its commercial hub. Those plans will collapse within 3 years. The Haitian Revolution will destroy the French Caribbean dream. Yellow fever will decimate Napoleon's army. And in 1803, Napoleon will sell Louisiana to the United States for what amounts to 3 cents an acre. But in 1800, standing in this rebuilt, twice burned, stubbornly living city, none of that is known yet. What is known is that something remarkable has already happened. A city that burned twice, that was governed by a reluctant empire that absorbed French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean cultures into something entirely its own. That city exists. It is real. It is loud and imperfect and alive. From this place you understand the full arc of the survival equation. Disaster happens. The city rebuilds. The rebuilding forges a new identity. And that identity is strong enough to survive every power shift that follows. Today, the French Quarter, Spanish in its bones, French in its name, American in its context, African in its cultural soul, receives millions of visitors a year. They come for the food, the music, the atmosphere. They rarely know that the atmosphere was forged in fire, shaped by reluctant colonizers, and fundamentally defined by enslaved people in a field on a Sunday afternoon. But that is the story. All of it together. The Mississippi River, then the economic artery of half a continent, the reason every empire wanted this city, now still one of the busiest commercial waterways in the world. The river hasn't changed its argument. The levee system, then, earthen embankments built by enslaved labor, perpetually at risk of failure. Now a complex engineering network and, as 2005 proved, still not entirely sufficient. The river's threat is older than any solution. Royal Street, then, the address of colonial wealth. Merchants and officials in formal clothes, building fortunes on other people's labor. Now, galleries and antique shops, still elegant, still carrying the weight of history in its walls, even when no one reads it. Congo Square, then, an open field where enslaved people kept their culture alive on Sunday afternoons under the careful eye of colonial authority. Now Armstrong Park, named for the man who carried this city's music to the world. The square won the long argument. The Place d'Armes, then an unpaved ground where soldiers drilled and authority announced itself through punishment and proclamation. Now Jackson Square, manicured gardens, tarot readers, street musicians. The performance continues, only the performers have changed. The great fire sites of 1788 then, 900 buildings reduced to ash in a single afternoon. Now, the French Quarter, every brick in it a consequence of that fire, though you would never know it from the tourism brochures. Louis Cathedral, then, burned to the ground in 1788, rebuilt by a merchant who understood that generosity is also strategy. Now the oldest continuously active cathedral in the United States, still facing the same square, still sharing it with the Cabildo. The Cabildo then, the engine of Spanish colonial administration, land grants, legal cases, the bureaucracy of empire. Now a museum, and the room where the Louisiana Purchase was signed. The colonial administrative building became the room where the colonial era ended. The Spanish barracks, then, a symbol of Spain's military insecurity, soldiers stationed not to protect the city from outside threats, but to remind it who was in charge. Now, barely a trace in the physical city. The soldiers left. The street grid they helped define remained. The Presbytère, an ambitious half-built statement of clerical power that Spain never quite finished. Now, home to the Mardi Gras Museum, clerical order replaced by the city's most joyfully chaotic tradition. We started with fire, March 21st, 1788. A candle, a chapel, a southern wind, and a city that should, by any rational measure, have been abandoned after what followed. It was not abandoned. It never was. What New Orleans did between 1773 and 1800 under Spanish rule through two catastrophic fires, through reluctant governance and cultural upheaval and the constant threat of flood, was demonstrate something that goes beyond colonial history. It demonstrated that cities are not their buildings, they are their people, and the people of New Orleans in this period, French Creoles, who refused to become Spanish administrators who never felt quite at home, free people of color building lives in the margins of a brutal system, enslaved people preserving culture in a field on Sunday afternoons, all of them together created something the governors and generals and empires could not have designed if they had tried. The survival equation played out completely, disaster struck, the city rebuilt. The rebuilding forged a new identity, and that identity proved stronger than any flag that flew over it. We asked at the beginning, what made this city worth fighting over? The answer by now is clear. Not just the river, though the river matters. Not just the trade, though trade kept it alive. What made New Orleans worth fighting over was what it was becoming: layered, complicated, culturally richer than anywhere else in North America, and impossible to fully control. That is still true today. Tell me in the comments which part of this story stayed with you: the fires, Congo Square, the ironwork balconies of a Spanish city wearing a French name. And if you want us to go deeper into another city, another era, another place where history is stranger and richer than the textbooks let on, write it below. We will go there.